Hey there, let me show you how I built this scene. The first thing I needed to do was create a model of the Renault FT-17 tank turret. Since I couldn't find a decent free version online, and none of the ones I did find were up to my quality standards, I decided to make my own kit. One major issue is that I'm working with an FDM 3D printer, and getting a good result on it takes some serious effort. So I made my own model set. I decided to make the turret both as a single solid model and also as a version split into separate parts. That way, for example, you can leave the hatch open or rotate the gun in whichever direction you like. Overall, I can say my printer did a great job handling this task. Although I almost ruined the whole thing while removing the supports, came really close to messing it up with my own hands. Thankfully, it all worked out in the end, and I was able to clean off all the excess plastic and fully assemble the turret. Or more accurately, not a turret for a tank, but rather a turret that's going to be placed on top of a bunker. To get the scale right, I used the 1/72nd scale figure as a reference, and as you can see, everything lines up well. Of course, there are plenty of small issues that come up even when building a model like this, but overall, considering this thing in size of my thumb's fingertip, I think it turned out pretty nicely. Which means we can move on to painting. This time I decided to skip the priming step and went straight to paint with a brush. Fortunately, FDM printed models allow for that kind of approach. For the base color, I used a mix of Middlestone from ACM and a bit of golden yellow from Vallejo. Now, just to be clear, the turret won't stay yellow, because I plan to add camouflage. I looked through a ton of FT-17 camouflage variation and settled on this one. It seemed like one of the most interesting options for me, so I started working on the camo. The second color I used was Shadow Flash from Vallejo's Panzer XS series. It works really well with a yellow base and does a great job capturing the tones typically seen on this kind of camouflage. After applying the second camouflage color, I used black paint from ACM to outline the camo pattern, since that technique was commonly used on these tanks. For the third color, I went an olive green. I don't even remember the brand, just one of the leftover paints I had that happened to be a perfect match for this turret's camo. Once all the main colors were in place, I could say the camouflage work was done. Next step was detailing. That means wash, slight damage and weathering in general. But let me say right away, there won't be much visible damage on this turret. After all, the thing I'm going to take place before the war starts. What I really wanted to capture was a moment in France around 1939. Two brothers in arms sharing a celebration or just relaxing after duty, drinking a bottle of French wine. And just to clarify, I'm not trying to push the clichés that if it's French, then it's always wine. I simply wanted to express a calm and peaceful moment before the storm, to make the contrast even more dramatic. Anyway, while I was talking, the oil wash was already being applied. This time, I am once again using oil-based products, but I'll stop at using pure black paint and gone back to my favorite, Van Dyke Brown. Now I need to focus on simulating paint wear. This turret's been exposed to the sun and changing weather like rain, storm and so on, so the paint shouldn't look fresh. To simulate this, I mixed three tones, one slightly darker than the base, one matching it and one a bit lighter. Then I started applying them using the tapping method. Here is the result as the process unfolds. But don't worry, this isn't the final look. After all the colors were applied, I softened everything with a standard brush and warm water to blend it better. I repeated the same process with all the camo colors used on the turret, and also added light highlights to the raised edges. Once everything dried, I had a great foundation for the next stage of effect. Also, I painted the barrel black to break up the pattern a bit. Having it camouflaged made the whole turret look way too toy-like. Next, I brought in a few oil colors: dark ochre, light ochre and burnt umber. I applied them to the darker camo zones. That gave the model a nice combination of grime and a touch of rust, just enough to suggest aging without overdoing it. Before moving on with additional washes and weathering effect, I decided to add some markings. Realistically, bunker-mounted turrets probably didn't have numbers, so I painted a small black heart here instead, just as a personal touch. Then came a bit more wash and some metallic accents using gunmetal paint from Vallejo. And that's it, the turret is done, no more work needed. Now it's time to move on the other elements, and there is quite a few of them. For example, here is a barrel, presumably used for storing water. I also planned to add a wooden crate and a cart. Maybe one of the soldiers used this cart to bring the wine bottles they'll be drinking. Speaking of which, here are the bottles. And at this point I shouldn't remind you, all these models are available for download from my page on Cal3D. The cards come in several versions, both as a solid piece and like the one I used, as a kit of separate parts you can glue together, or not glue if you want to depict a broken card. That's entirely up to you. As always, you'll find all the links in the video description. And here is how it looks once assembly is complete. Now that the card is done, we can move on to the next step, working on the figures. I completely understand the complaints I got in previous video. Many people said the figures were low quality and badly painted. And honestly, you are right. I was so disappointed with those particular minis that I just didn't think they were worth the time and effort. But that's not the case with these two gentlemen. This time I want to paint them properly and give them the attention they deserve. Quick apology in advance, the camera will go out of focus from time to time. Painting figures in 1/72 scale is a real challenge. Anyway, let me walk you through the process. For the paints, I'm using middle stone from ICM, a color that works really well for French tanker uniforms. It also fits nicely with the overall palette of the diorama. Then I added subtle shadows into the folds using tan earth from ICM. After a bit of refinement, I moved on to the highlight. I tried a few different approaches and finally decided to stick with what I know best, mostly using dry brushing. Yeah, I know that we have a lot of different methods for painting miniatures. And my modeling friends tell me something about the dot painting method, and I really do want to try it, but not this time. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time for that level of detailing right now. Once the highlighting was done, the trousers were finished, and I could move on the tanker jacket. This jacket will be black with just a hint of blue, a common look for French tankers. Since both figures wear the same uniform, I decided to add some variety. So one figure will have a black leather jacket and the other a brown leather jacket. I think this small difference will make the scene more visually interesting. For shadows on the jacket I just use standard black. Works great to define depth. After that I highlighted the raised areas to bring out the texture and volume. With the jacket done, it was time for a smaller details, like a scarf. From what I could find, French tankers often wore a white scarf. I didn't find much info about other colors, so I went with white. It created nice contrast against the uniform. As for painting the face, that part's pretty straightforward. I used the same technique I showed in a dedicated video. Start with a wash of shadow flash, then paint in the eyes. Make correction and apply highlights. Once the face was done, I moved on to finishing touch. Refining small details and painting black outlines between clothing and gear to separate the shapes more clearly. And here is how the figures turned out. Yeah, it could be painted even better, but honestly, I'm happy with how it looked. I painted the second figure off camera, and here is how it turned out. Honestly, this one was even easier to paint. You could say almost the entire figure was done using the dry brushing technique. As you can see, comparing the two figures, I spent about 2 hours on the first one, but the second I painted in just about 20 or 30 minutes. For 1/72 scale, dry brushing is just a lifesaver, especially if your figures doesn't have tons of tiny details, like this. Alright, now that the figures are painted, we can move on to the rest of the diorama details. The first was painting the barrel. The barrel model I created is really simple to paint, because I designated it specifically with dry brushing in mind. You just apply a base color, then highlight the wooden parts and finally accentuate the metal rim. And that's it, you end up with a barrel that looks like this. Of course, off camera I add a little bit wash. Since the barrel is done, it's time to move on to the main feature of the diorama. The bunker with the Renault FT17 turret mounted on it. I looked at many different versions and decided to make some modification to fit my vision. I adjusted the bunker's appearance to suit my needs. Then I started painting. For the base color I mixed black with Vallejo's Dectan and painted the entire foam bunker with it. Foam was chosen as a material because when treated properly it's excellent for simulating concrete surfaces, which is exactly what I wanted to achieve. The next day after the bunker dried, I grabbed some new brushes and began dry brushing the first highlights. There will be several layers, because the more variation you have in the grey, black and white on your concrete bunker, the more realistic and interesting it looks. Sure, you could just paint it dark grey and then add light grey highlights, but it would still look like a plastic and like flat thing. Basically, I'm adding as much dirt and texture as possible. Then I gently blend those layers using a color close to, but not exactly, the base color. Why? Because it adds another layer of variation on the bunker surface. And of course, the finishing touch is applying a wash, my favorite oil-based brown wash, Van Dyke Brown. It works perfectly here. And this is the result. I think the bunker looks wonderful. Just look at the small details. Some of them even look like realistic cracks. Isn't that amazing? Next I spent some time creating the base for the diorama. I do it all off camera, but for the base I used the foam material from my previous video. This time I went back to my favorite oval shape, kind of like a painter's palette. I think these shapes work really well for dioramas, like in this case. As you can see, there is a dedicated spot for the bunker, steps leading inside it and a separate area. And don't laugh, for a rod. I just can't help myself, apparently all my dioramas have rods. I'll look through each one and there is always a rod somewhere. I don't know why, maybe it's because I want to travel somewhere, but for now sadly I can't. Alright, enough about my problems, let's get back to discussing the diorama building process. As you can see, I'm applying this wonderful stuff called texture paste. I've been using this material in all my recent videos, because it's just perfect for diorama needs. Though it's originally an artist's material for painting. This time I decided to make the rod proper. It's going to be a broken up rod, rarely traveled, so it's dried out and the ruts left from rain have stayed there. I didn't want to mess around with epoxy or pour any extra material on it, just wanted to make the rod and show that, yes, there is a rod here. That's basically it, no other plans for the rod. The only thing I did was narrow the rod a bit to leave space on the opposite side of the diorama. From a composition standpoint, I need to fill that side with something too, so the diorama won't feel overloaded on the one side and empty on the other. Also, this time I didn't skimp on adding some stones for detail. Just a few, enough so they won't spoil the overall look. Now the diorama goes off to dry. While I start making the elements for the opposite side of the bunker. Here I want to create an old broken fence and a signpost. For that I'm using my standard material, thin wooden strips. It's pretty simple. Using a modeling knife, you just break the wood randomly to create a shattered fence. Then, flipping the knife flat, you peel off the fibers that come loose. And in the end you get a broken, beaten, saved up length. Call it whatever you want, which works quite well for simulating a destroyed fence. And this is what my fence turned out like. Simple, but it won't spoil the thing. Same goes for the signpost. You probably noticed the bunker is already glued onto the diorama, and I filled all gaps and spaces around it with a texture paste. That means we can now move on to painting the diorama. For the base color I choose German Pale Brown by Vallejo. I didn't dry brush in this time. I literally just painted the whole diorama, not worrying too much if I missed a spot here or there. Once it dried, I made corrections, touching up and adding color where needed. Also, after fixing all the mistakes made while placing the bunker, I decided to add some moss with green paint. Moss usually grows on concrete surfaces, so I didn't make it too bright, just a little to add some variety. Then, using the color Tan Earth from ACM, I painted the fences and the signpost. But this is just the base color, I still need to apply a wash to these elements, which will really bring them to life. Now I need to shift my focus back to the card. Overall the card turned out quite decent. There are some areas that could be improved or some details that could be added, but for now this version fully satisfied me and fits perfectly with the needs of my diorama. I choose red for this card because, and I say this in every video, I love contrast. The more contrast in a diorama, the more interesting it becomes. That doesn't mean every element should be mega contrasty and look like a rainbow explosion. But for example, against a grey bunker, a camouflage painted turret and a red card will look absolutely fantastic. The card itself was painted with ACM's deep red base color. I really like this color and I think it's one of the best reds I've ever seen in my life. Although, to be honest, I haven't seen that many paint in my life. After finishing the lighter wood tones, which reassemble old wood, I started adding damage to the card using dry brushing. Basically, the painting process for this card is quite simple. We paint the card in the base color, then use the dry brush technique, and in the end you get a card like this. I think this result is perfectly fine for 1/72 scale, and it will complement my diorama beautifully. But the final touch for the card was applying a wash. I used one dike again. It worked great on this card. It hides the overlay bright base, makes it look more wooden, and overall gives the card a worn and used appearance. By the way, I applied this same wash to the fence and the signpost, as I mentioned earlier. Then mixing a lighter and more orange wash, actually closer to a light brown, almost like burnt umber, I started applying wash over the diorama. This gave me the following result. Now the diorama's texture look more varied and the ground look very natural. The only thing I wanted to do was make the rot appear deeper and show that it's truly a depression in the terrain, so it stands out more. I wanted the lower part of the diorama to be darker than the upper part. This way the difference in height will be clearer, creating the right impression in the scene. After everything dried, I glued the Renault FT17 turret in place and applied a wash along the joint between the turret and the bunker. This adds an extra shadow and basically visually connects two elements into one cohesive model. I also added some brown wash on the bunker itself to better blend it with the overall color theme of the diorama. After all, it's a dusty and dirt environment, and the dirt should come from the local area where the bunker stands, so the bunker needs to match the color of the surrounding terrain. After that, I glued the barrel and the cart into their places and moved on to some additional details, specifically painting the stones. This part was simple. Some stones I painted light grey and just a few I colored with middle stone. This again adds variety to the overall color palette of the diorama and creates some small focal points. The next extra detail I decided to place near the bunker was this tag, which you can also download and find on Minecraft's 3D page. Painting this detail was quite straightforward. I painted it entirely in tan earth and then used dry brushing to add wear and tear. to show that this sack isn't new anymore. Yes, up close the sack looks a bit strange, and you can see all those ugly lines left by the FDM printer. But believe me, from the usual viewing distance of a 1/72 scale diorama, it's not noticeable at all. Once this detail was in place, it was time to work on the bottles. At first I wanted to paint them in a bright glossy acrylic paint, but then I thought that an extra shine might actually spoil the overall effect, so I decided to paint them in a matte green instead. Then I glued the figures to see where it would be best to place the bottles, and to decide which crate to use on the diorama, the one I showed you at the beginning or maybe a different crate. After the figures were glued, I started placing the bottles in their designated spots. In the end I chose the wooden basket, and it found its place with several bottles glued on top. Unfortunately, I can't share wooden basket with you just yet, but I am currently working on a huge set of these baskets, so keep an eye out, subscribe to my channel and Cal's 3D page so you won't miss them. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to place the grass on the diorama. I got these wonderful brushes and wanted to see if I could achieve the same effect I usually get with flocking, but using these brushes instead. The problem is, I probably need to buy new flocking material, but I don't have extra funds right now, so I decided to make do with what I have. Overall, these brushes look cute, although some might find them a bit too bright. But I can say that for me this semi-cartoonish style is actually quite acceptable. In the end I placed about 16 brushes on the diorama, and they look pretty cool, at least I'm happy with them. But a few final touches remained. I needed to use dry brushing with a light color to show places where there are no brushes, to indicate spots where people walk more often, so the grass just doesn't grow there. And I think I did this really well. So that means the work on this diorama is finished. And now we move on to the final reveal. Well, this time I'm really satisfied with everything on this diorama. The number of elements, the vegetation, the pieces themselves, everything I think turned out quite well. Also the landscape, finally I managed to create a landscape that looks more realistic. Maybe I am praising myself too much, but the overall picture feels very peaceful. I love military-themed dioramas, but those that look so calm and peaceful that you can start paying attention not to the tank or weapons, or explosion or damage, but more to the environment, the stones, the grass, the cart, the old fence. Your attention is drawn to literally everything, and the diorama becomes a completely picture, rather than just a showcase for equipment, like some of my previous works and many other modelers' works. Again, that's just my personal opinion. I really like it that way, and I always strive for that. So please share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, please hit the thumb up, subscribe to the channel, comment below and share it with your friends and fellow modelers. Also don't forget that all the models used on this diorama, except for the figures of course, are available on my Cal's 3D page. For those who want to support me, I also have a Patreon page. This was Vlad from the Noquality Dioramas channel as always. Don't forget to appreciate your loved ones, tell them you love them and that they're important to you. And don't forget to show it through your action. Take care of yourself. See you soon. Chicky boom!